March 12, 1944. Stalag VII-A, near Moosburg, Bavaria. A leather ball rolled across frozen mud, chased by men in tattered uniforms who should have been enemies. The sound echoed off barbed wire fences that separated the playing field from rows of wooden barracks stretching toward distant watchtowers. German guards stood at attention, rifles slung across shoulders, watching not with hostility but with something approaching curiosity. On the makeshift pitch below, British prisoners and their German captors competed in a soccer match that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. This was not liberation. This was not peace. This was still captivity, with all its humiliations and hardships. Yet for 90 minutes each Sunday afternoon, something shifted. The guard became a teammate. The prisoner became a competitor. And in the space between those contradictions, men discovered they could be human again. Stalag VII-A opened in September 1939, designed to hold 5,000 prisoners. By 1943, it contained over 76,000 men from nearly every nation involved in the war. British, French, American, Soviet, Polish, Belgian soldiers crowded into barracks built for a quarter of their number. The camp sprawled across 200 acres of Bavarian farmland, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire 10 feet high. Guard towers stood every 50 yards, manned day and night. Searchlights swept the grounds after dark. The perimeter was mined. Escape was theoretically possible but practically suicidal. The men who arrived here came from defeated campaigns across Europe and North Africa. They'd surrendered at Dunkirk, at Tobruk, in the deserts of Tunisia and the mountains of Greece. Some had been prisoners for months, others for years. All carried the weight of capture, that peculiar shame of surviving when others had not. The camp operated according to the Geneva Convention, which meant prisoners received food parcels from the Red Cross, could send and receive letters, had access to basic medical care. But the convention said nothing about dignity. It made no provisions for purpose or meaning. It could not address the grinding boredom of captivity or the psychological erosion that came from having nothing to do, nothing to decide, nothing to control. Days passed with numbing sameness. Roll call at dawn, standing in formation while guards counted bodies. Distribution of rations, never quite enough to satisfy hunger. Hours spent in barracks, lying on bunks, staring at wooden slats overhead. Men talked endlessly about food they'd eaten before the war, about women they'd known, about homes they might never see again. The British prisoners organized themselves according to military hierarchy. Officers maintained discipline, assigned tasks, ran educational programs using textbooks sent by the Red Cross. They taught languages, mathematics, history, anything to keep minds occupied. Some men carved chess pieces from scrap wood. Others memorized poetry or wrote letters that might never be mailed. But education could not fill empty hours or restore lost agency. The men were not being punished, exactly. They were simply being contained. Kept alive but stripped of purpose. Allowed to exist but not to live. The German guards were mostly older men, veterans of the First World War too old for frontline service, or younger soldiers recovering from injuries that disqualified them from combat duty. They enforced rules without particular cruelty. Prisoners who violated regulations faced confinement or reduced rations, but systematic brutality was rare. The guards were not monsters. They were men doing a job, keeping order in a facility designed to warehouse human beings until someone decided what to do with them. Still, the divide between captor and captive remained absolute. Guards wore uniforms that signified authority. Prisoners wore clothes that marked their defeat. The separation was physical, psychological, moral. These men existed in the same physical space but occupied different worlds. In late November 1943, a Red Cross parcel arrived at Stalag VII-A containing something unexpected. Among the usual items, tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, someone had included a leather soccer ball. The ball itself was unremarkable. Standard size and weight, manufactured in Britain, somewhat scuffed from previous use. But in that place, at that moment, it represented possibility. Not escape, exactly. Not freedom in any conventional sense. But the chance to do something rather than nothing, to move rather than wait, to compete rather than merely endure. British prisoners immediately recognized the ball's potential. Many had played soccer before the war, some competitively. The sport was woven into British working-class culture, part of the rhythm of ordinary life they'd left behind. A match on Saturday afternoon. The roar of the crowd. The simple pleasure of running, kicking, competing. Captain Robert Hamilton, a former schoolteacher from Lancashire who'd been captured at Tobruk in 1942, took charge of organizing a league. He was 34 years old, lean from inadequate rations, but his mind remained sharp. He understood that men needed purpose as much as food. Something to anticipate. Something to care about. Hamilton approached the camp commandant, Oberst Friedrich Müller, with a formal request. The prisoners wanted permission to organize soccer matches on a cleared section of ground near the eastern fence line. They would maintain the field themselves, set their own schedules, referee their own games. They asked only for permission and access. Müller was 59 years old, a career officer who'd fought in the trenches of the Western Front in 1917. He'd seen what happened when men had nothing to occupy their minds. Boredom bred despair. Despair bred discipline problems. Discipline problems created administrative headaches. If soccer could occupy prisoners' time and reduce tensions, he had no objection. But there was a condition. If British prisoners wanted a proper league, they would need more than one ball. And if they wanted proper matches, they would need proper teams. Which meant including the guards. This created an immediate dilemma. Could British soldiers who'd sworn to resist their captors now agree to play alongside them? Was cooperation acceptable if it improved conditions? Or did any collaboration with the enemy constitute betrayal? The prisoners debated the question in evening barracks discussions. Some argued that maintaining rigid separation was their duty. Others insisted that soccer was just soccer, a game with no political meaning. A few pointed out that the Geneva Convention encouraged athletic activity as beneficial to prisoner health. Hamilton made the practical argument. They had one ball. They could either use it for occasional kickabouts among prisoners, or they could organize a proper league that might acquire additional equipment and better facilities. The choice was between principle and pragmatism. The prisoners voted. The decision was narrow, but clear. They would organize a league that included German guards as participants. The first matches took place in December 1943 on a field that was more mud than grass. The prisoners had cleared rocks and debris, marked boundaries with whitewashed lines, fashioned goalposts from scrap lumber. The pitch was smaller than regulation size, sloping slightly toward the eastern end, but it was recognizably a soccer field. Teams formed along national and barracks lines. The British fielded multiple squads based on where prisoners were housed. French prisoners organized their own teams. The German guards formed two teams, one consisting of regular staff, the other of convalescent soldiers recovering from injuries. The rules were simple. 90-minute matches, 2 halves, standard soccer regulations. No special provisions for prisoners versus guards. On the field, rank meant nothing. A private could tackle an officer. A prisoner could score against his captor. The game was sovereign. The first match pitted a British team against a German guard squad. Neither side knew quite what to expect. Would the guards use the game to assert dominance? Would the prisoners hold back, afraid of consequences? Would violence erupt under the cover of legitimate physical contact? Instead, something stranger happened. Both teams played seriously. Hard, competitive soccer with proper formations, strategic passing, genuine effort to win. The guards didn't go easy on the prisoners. The prisoners didn't defer to their captors. For 90 minutes, they were simply soccer players, bound by rules older than this war. The British team won that first match, 3-2. The German guards shook hands with their opponents afterward. No speeches were made. No dramatic gestures of reconciliation. Just men acknowledging that a game had been played, that one side had won, that this was acceptable. Word spread through the camp. More teams wanted to participate. Prisoners who hadn't played soccer in years began training, running laps around the barracks to build endurance. Guards who'd spent their military service maintaining order suddenly had something to look forward to after their shifts ended. Hamilton organized a formal league with scheduled matches, standings posted in the barracks, even primitive statistics tracking goals and assists. The games occurred every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting. Attendance was voluntary but crowds grew. Men who weren't playing gathered around the field to watch, offering commentary, shouting encouragement, arguing about referee decisions. The matches became rituals. Structures of meaning in a world designed to strip meaning away. Prisoners spent their weeks thinking about Sunday's game, discussing strategy, remembering great plays. The guards did the same. In conversations about soccer, the usual barriers softened. A guard might ask a prisoner about British playing styles. A prisoner might compliment a guard's footwork. These exchanges were brief, specific, bounded by the game's neutrality. But they were exchanges nonetheless. By early 1944, the soccer league had transformed camp dynamics in ways no one anticipated. The most obvious change was physical. Men who'd been wasting away from boredom and inadequate rations began moving, training, competing. Their health improved, not dramatically, but measurably. Doctors noticed the difference. But the psychological effects ran deeper. Prisoners who played soccer recovered something precious: agency. For 90 minutes each Sunday, they made decisions that mattered. Where to pass the ball. When to shoot. How to defend. These were trivial choices in the grand scheme of war, but they were choices. In a place designed to deny choice, that meant everything. The guards experienced something similar. Most had not chosen to work at a prison camp. They'd been assigned, told to maintain order and prevent escapes. It was duty, not preference. But soccer gave them something beyond duty. A reason to take pride in performance. A space where they could be athletes rather than jailers. Unexpected friendships formed, though friendship is perhaps too strong a word. These were relationships of mutual respect, bounded by circumstance but genuine within those bounds. A British forward and a German defender who marked each other closely each week developed a rapport. They learned each other's moves, anticipated each other's strategies. After matches, they might exchange brief comments about the game. "You're faster on the left side. I'll remember that next week. Your positioning is better. I'll need to adjust." These conversations never strayed beyond soccer. They didn't discuss the war, politics, what would happen when the fighting ended. The game created a neutral zone where such topics remained unspoken. But within that zone, human connection became possible. The camp's administrative records from this period showed declining disciplinary incidents. Escape attempts decreased. Medical reports documented improved morale. The Red Cross inspector who visited in March 1944 noted in his report that Stalag VII-A had an unusually positive atmosphere for a facility of its size. Oberst Muller understood what was happening, even if he didn't articulate it explicitly. The soccer league had given everyone, guards and prisoners alike, something to care about beyond the grinding reality of the war. It had created structure where structure meant hope, routine where routine meant sanity. There were complications, of course. Some prisoners refused to participate, considering any cooperation with guards to be collaboration. Political officers within the camp, men responsible for maintaining prisoner resistance, worried that soccer was making captivity too comfortable, eroding the will to escape. These concerns were not entirely groundless. The line between accepting necessary cooperation and becoming complicit in one's own imprisonment was thin and easily crossed. But most prisoners recognized the difference. They were not betraying the Allied cause by playing soccer. They were surviving captivity with dignity intact. The guards faced similar judgment from peers. Soldiers rotating in from frontline service sometimes mocked the soccer league, viewing it as soft. Real soldiers didn't play games with prisoners. Real soldiers maintained absolute separation. But those criticisms usually came from men who'd never worked in a prison camp, who didn't understand the daily reality of containing thousands of men with nothing to lose. Spring 1944 brought warming weather and expanded league play. What had begun as a handful of teams grew to nearly 20, with matches scheduled throughout the week. The camp acquired additional soccer balls through Red Cross parcels and even purchased one through official channels, a rare instance of the German military spending resources on prisoner recreation. The quality of play improved as well. Men who'd been casual players before captivity developed real skill through constant practice. The best teams developed sophisticated strategies, coordinated attacks, disciplined defenses. Matches became genuinely competitive, not just time fillers but actual athletic contests. An unofficial championship emerged, with the camp's best teams competing for supremacy. A British team from Barracks 14, composed largely of former factory workers from Birmingham, became dominant. They played an aggressive, physical style that frustrated opponents and delighted spectators. Their captain, a toolmaker named James Brennan, had played semi-professionally before the war. His teammates deferred to his tactical judgment, and he transformed them into a cohesive unit. Their main rival was a German Guard team led by Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, a former coal miner from the Ruhr Valley who'd been wounded during the invasion of France. Schmidt had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to shrapnel, enough to disqualify him from combat duty but not enough to prevent him from playing soccer. He was a brutal defender, using his body to intimidate forwards, never yielding an inch of the field. The matches between Brennan's British team and Schmidt's German squad became camp events. Hundreds of men gathered to watch, divided not along national lines but according to team loyalty. British prisoners cheered for Schmidt's team if they played well. German guards applauded Brennan's goals when they were particularly skillful. In May 1944, these two teams met in what everyone understood would be the season's decisive match. Neither side had lost a game. Whoever won would be acknowledged as camp champions. The day was warm, the field dry and fast. Both teams arrived early, warming up with focused intensity. The spectators lined the boundaries, some standing, others sitting on the ground. Guards from the watchtowers had clear views and watched with interest. Even Oberst Müller came out to observe. The match was brutal and brilliant. Schmidt's defenders marked Brennan closely, never giving him space to work. Brennan's forwards pressed relentlessly, forcing mistakes. The first half ended scoreless, both teams exhausted but determined. In the second half, the British scored first on a long shot that curved past the German goalkeeper. The crowd erupted. Schmidt's team pushed forward, risking defensive stability to equalize. With 10 minutes remaining, they succeeded, scoring on a corner kick that bounced through traffic into the goal. Neither team could score again. The match ended in a draw, which meant nothing was decided. But something had been demonstrated. Two groups of men, divided by war, contained by barbed wire, reduced to captor and captive, had played 90 minutes of honest, competitive soccer. They'd given everything to win. They'd respected their opponent's skill. They'd accepted the referee's decisions. They'd behaved, in other words, like civilized human beings in a world that had ceased to be civilized. After the match, Brennan and Schmidt shook hands. It was a formal gesture, brief and without commentary. But witnesses remembered it. Something had shifted. The game was still just a game. The war was still happening. Men were still dying on battlefields across Europe. But in this one place, for these men, the categories of enemy and ally had become more complicated than anyone expected. By June 1944, the soccer league at Stalag VII-A had become the camp's defining feature. New prisoners arriving from other facilities expressed amazement at what they found. The Red Cross featured the program in its bulletin as an example of humanitarian treatment. Even German military authorities noted it favorably in reports. But the world beyond the camp's fences was changing rapidly. On June 6, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The war entered its final phase. For prisoners, this meant hope that captivity might end soon. For guards, it meant uncertainty about what Allied victory would mean for them. The soccer matches continued, but the atmosphere shifted. Everyone understood that decisions made far away would determine all their futures. The game that had created a space outside the war now existed inside the war's closing chapter. Some prisoners argued the league should be disbanded. Playing soccer with Germans while Allied soldiers died in France felt wrong to them. The political officers intensified their criticism, pointing out that collaboration in any form aided the enemy. Why make the guards' jobs easier? Why help maintain a pleasant prison camp when resistance and disruption were moral obligations? These arguments gained traction, especially among newly arrived American prisoners who hadn't been part of the League's development. To them, the sight of British prisoners laughing with German guards seemed like collaboration, not survival. Hamilton defended the program vigorously. The soccer league hadn't made prisoners collaborators. It had kept them sane, healthy, and human. That was not betrayal. That was endurance. But his arguments convinced fewer men as summer progressed. The guards faced their own version of these questions. Frontline soldiers, wounded and recovering at Stalag VII-A temporarily before reassignment, expressed contempt for the soccer matches. Playing with prisoners while the fatherland fought for survival was dereliction of duty. Some guards began refusing to participate, feeling the League had become politically suspect. By August, the League was fracturing. Several teams withdrew. Matches became less frequent. Crowds dwindled. The thing that had united the camp was coming apart under pressure from external events neither guards nor prisoners could control. April 27, 1945. American forces approached Moosburg from the west. The sound of artillery could be heard in the distance, drawing closer each day. The camp's German garrison prepared for surrender or withdrawal, depending on orders that might never come. Stalag VII-A now held over 130,000 prisoners, swollen by influxes from camps further east as Germany collapsed. The facilities were overwhelmed. Food was scarce. Medical supplies exhausted. The orderly structure that had characterized the camp through most of the war had disintegrated. The soccer league had ended months earlier, its final official match played in October 1944. But on that April morning, Brennan found the old leather ball stored in the barracks. It was deflated and cracked, barely usable, but recognizably the same ball that had arrived in November 1943. He brought it to the field and began kicking it around, more from habit than intent. Schmidt saw him from the guard tower and descended, his shift ending. Neither man spoke. They just started playing, passing the ball back and forth, no goals, no score, just movement and muscle memory. Others joined them gradually. British prisoners. German guards. French, American, Polish prisoners. Even a few Soviet prisoners, kept in separate compounds, came to the fence to watch. Within an hour, enough men had gathered for an actual match, though no one bothered forming official teams or keeping score. They played for 2 hours that afternoon, ignoring the artillery growing louder, ignoring the chaos consuming the camp, ignoring the ending that approached from all directions. They played because the game was there to be played, because their bodies remembered how, because nothing else made sense anymore. American forces liberated Stalag VII-A on April 29, 1945. General George Patton himself visited the camp, his face hardening at what he saw. The conditions by then were terrible, and prisoners looked like concentration camp victims, emaciated and weak. But when Patton learned about the soccer league, when British officers described how the game had functioned during the war years, something shifted in his expression. He understood immediately what had happened. Not collaboration. Not fraternization. But survival through maintained humanity. The men of Stalag VII-A dispersed after liberation. British prisoners returned to England. French and Polish prisoners went home to countries that had been transformed by occupation. The German guards entered Allied custody, facing uncertain futures in a defeated nation. Brennan returned to Birmingham and his toolmaking job. The city had been bombed extensively. Many factories lay in ruins. His own street had been destroyed. He moved into temporary housing and tried to resume the life interrupted by war. But he kept thinking about the matches at Stalag VII-A. Not sentimentally, not as some magical period of reconciliation. The camp had been a prison, his captors had been the enemy, the circumstances had been humiliating and degrading. Yet the soccer had been real. The competition had been genuine. And the men on the opposite team had been, within the bounds of the game, teammates as much as opponents. Schmidt returned to the Ruhr Valley to find his hometown largely destroyed by Allied bombing. His wife and 2 children had survived, living with relatives. He worked in reconstruction, clearing rubble, rebuilding factories, participating in the enormous project of restoring Germany from ruins. He never spoke about the soccer league at Stalag VII-A. It seemed irrelevant to the Germany that was emerging, irrelevant to the questions of guilt and responsibility that consumed the nation. Yet he thought about it. About those Sunday afternoons when being a man meant something simpler than being German or being guilty. In 1957, Brennan made an unusual decision. He traveled to Germany, ostensibly for business, actually to find Schmidt. It took him 3 days, asking questions, following leads, but he eventually located him working at a rebuilt steel plant. Their conversation was brief and awkward. Neither man knew quite what to say. They couldn't apologize for the war, couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't pretend they'd been friends. But they acknowledged what they'd shared. Those matches. That strange period when the game had mattered more than the war. "You were a good player," Brennan said in his limited German. "You were better," Schmidt replied in equally limited English. They shook hands and parted. They never met again. But the meeting itself meant something. An acknowledgement that the enemy had been human, that humanity had persisted through captivity, that war had not completely destroyed their capacity for recognition. The soccer league at Stalag VII-A was never famous. It appeared in no history books, earned no medals, changed no military outcomes. Historians researching prisoner of war experiences occasionally find references to it in camp records or memoirs, but it remains a footnote to larger narratives about captivity and resistance. Yet for the men who participated, it represented something essential about survival. Not physical survival, though the activity helped maintain health. Emotional and psychological survival. The preservation of self through maintained agency. The insistence on being something more than just a prisoner or a guard. The game didn't erase the war. It didn't make captivity acceptable. It didn't transform enemies into friends. But it demonstrated that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people could choose to be human. They could compete honorably. They could respect opponents. They could play by rules and accept outcomes and maintain dignity. That was the legacy. Not reconciliation, exactly. Not redemption. Just a persistent reminder that the line between enemy and person is thinner than wartime rhetoric suggests. That soldiers are men. That captors are human. That even in places designed to deny humanity, humanity finds ways to persist. The leather ball that started it all was never found after liberation. It likely ended up in some American soldier's footlocker, or was left behind in the chaos of April 1945, or simply fell apart from overuse. But for 18 months, it had been more than a ball. It had been possibility itself. The chance to run. To compete. To be something other than a prisoner waiting for the war to end. In archival photographs from Stalag VII-A, you can sometimes see the soccer field in the background. Just a patch of cleared ground near the eastern fence, unremarkable in every way. But if you know what happened there, if you understand what those Sunday matches meant to men who had nothing else, the field looks different. It becomes a testament to what sport can do in the worst circumstances. Not change outcomes. Not prevent atrocities. But provide space where human beings can encounter each other as human beings, even when everything else insists they are enemies. That space was temporary. It existed only while the war lasted and only within the boundaries of that particular camp. When liberation came, it vanished like morning fog. But while it existed, it mattered. The men who played those matches, the prisoners and guards who competed in earnest, the spectators who watched and cheered regardless of nationality, they all carried something away from it. The memory of being human when humanity seemed impossible. The knowledge that even enemies can play together, at least for 90 minutes on a Sunday afternoon. The recognition that a game is sometimes more than a game. Sometimes, it's a reminder that we are all more than the roles war forces us to play. The war ended. The camp closed. The fence came down and the barracks were demolished. But the field remained for years afterward, a patch of cleared ground slowly returning to grass, still bearing faint traces of the goals that once stood there. Eventually, even those marks faded. But men who played there remembered. And in their remembering, the game lived on, not as history but as experience. A small, strange episode in a terrible war. A moment when soccer mattered more than anyone expected. A reminder that even in the darkest times, we can still choose to be decent to one another, at least for the duration of a match. That choice doesn't redeem war. It doesn't justify captivity. But it suggests that humanity is more resilient than the circumstances designed to crush it. That was the lesson of the soccer league at Stalag VII-A. Not a happy lesson or a comfortable one, but a true lesson nonetheless. The ball rolling across frozen mud in March 1944 was just a ball. But what happened around it was something more. Something that deserves remembering, not because it was heroic or extraordinary, but because it was profoundly ordinary. Men playing a game because games remind us we're human. Even here. Even now. Even when everything says otherwise.